slid into the pool beside me with a slow, steady movement, the water lifting against our chests until his knee brushed mine beneath the surface, and in that moment I knew this night would not end like our other quiet summer evenings. He said my name softly, letting it hang in the warm air between us, and his eyes kept dropping to my mouth before meeting mine again, like he was making up his mind about something he'd thought about for too long. The patio lights hummed above us. The water trembled with every subtle shift, and when his fingertips skimmed my shoulder before drifting away again, I understood his invitation hadn't been entirely about showing off the new pool. We had been neighbors for 5 years, divorced men who had learned to trade tools, share beers, and linger on each other's porches when the evening air was too good to waste. He was Ray to everyone, even me, and I was Ben to him whether I was mowing the lawn or carrying groceries. Our small talk always stretched longer than necessary, heavy with pauses that felt almost deliberate. We never said anything that could be called flirting, but there were looks, moments, and small silences that carried their own quiet charge. The new pool had gone in a month ago, and he'd teased me about coming over for a swim once the heater was working. Tonight, he texted that the water was perfect, and I walked over with a towel and a bad joke about lifeguard whistles. When I stepped through the side gate, he was barefoot on the deck, wearing swim shorts and a smile that made my mouth go dry. "Perfect timing," he said, handing me a beer before nodding toward the shallow steps. We drifted slowly, shoulders almost touching each time a ripple moved through the water. He asked about my day in that quiet, focused way of his that made me feel like nothing else in the world was competing for his attention. I told him I was tired, that work had been a grind, but I felt lighter now, and he smiled like that answer mattered more than it should. At one point, he shifted closer, just enough that our forearms met under the water, the contact brief but unmistakable. "I'm glad you came over," he said. Something in his tone made my chest tighten, because it wasn't just a neighbor's thank you, it was layered, meant to be heard more than once. The cicadas were starting up in the trees, the sky deepening toward night, and I found myself watching the way the pool lights traced over his collarbone. I'd told myself for years that we were just friends, that any line between us wasn't worth crossing, but when he leaned in slightly, his voice lower now, and said, "Feels good having you here," I wasn't so sure I still believed that. The water was warmer than I expected, the kind of warmth that makes you want to stay in longer than you planned, and I found myself drifting just close enough to hear the sound of his breathing over the faint hum of the filter. Ray had his elbows hooked on the edge of the pool, head tilted back, eyes half-lidded in the glow from the deck lights, and I couldn't stop noticing the way his shoulders cut through the water like they belonged there. We talked about nothing and everything, neighbors who had moved away, the old oak tree that might need trimming, the fact that neither of us had figured out dating apps. He laughed when I admitted I hadn't been on a second date in years, the sound low and warm, and I laughed too, even though I wasn't sure what part of it was actually funny. Every so often, his gaze would linger on me for just a fraction longer than it needed to, and each time it did, my stomach tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the swim. A small wave rolled between us as he pushed off the wall, closing the gap so smoothly it could have been an accident. "Water's better in the deep end," he said, his voice casual but his eyes holding mine, waiting. I followed, because of course I did, and the change in depth made us both tread water, our movements slow and deliberate, the circle we kept swimming around each other getting smaller with every turn. When we ended up close enough that our knees touched under the surface, neither of us moved away. "You ever miss it?" he asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "Sharing a space with someone. Not talking, just being in it together." I wanted to answer, but the way he looked at me made words feel clumsy. Instead, I dipped under the water for a moment, letting the quiet wrap around me before resurfacing to find him still watching. That stare felt like its own conversation, one that had been going on for years without either of us admitting it. We floated side by side for a while, facing opposite directions but close enough for our arms to brush now and then. And just when the silence began to feel too comfortable, he turned toward me, water dripping from his jawline, and said, "You could stay a little after we're done. I've got the fire pit ready." It wasn't a complicated invitation, but something about the way he said it steady, certain, made my pulse quicken. I nodded, maybe too quickly, and he smiled like he'd been hoping for that answer all night. A breeze moved across the surface, carrying the scent of wet stone and whatever aftershave he'd put on hours ago. I told myself not to read into it, not to assign meaning where there might be none. But then his hand broke the water between us, fingers grazing the back of mine in a touch so light I might have imagined it if he hadn't done it again. The gate latch clicked in the distance, a sound that sliced through the soft quiet of the backyard. Ray's head turned sharply toward the noise, and for the first time tonight, I saw something like hesitation cross his face. "Did you invite anyone else?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, eyes narrowing toward the dark beyond the fence. The sound came again, the faint creak of the wooden deck boards by the far side of the pool. Ray's voice dropped lower. "We're not alone." Ray didn't move right away, just kept his eyes locked on the far side of the pool, where the shadows thickened under the maple tree, his expression tightening in a way I hadn't seen before. The sound came again, softer this time, like a cautious step, followed by the faintest ripple of water brushing against the pool's edge. My heart started to race, not because I thought we were in danger, but because the intimacy between us suddenly felt fragile, something that could be broken if another pair of eyes landed on it. "Stay here," Ray murmured, but he didn't get out right away. He pushed a little closer to me first, lowering his voice until I could feel the warmth of it against my cheek. "If it's nothing, we don't talk about it. If it's something, we decide together." It wasn't the words that made me swallow hard, it was the way "together" sounded coming from him. He moved toward the steps with slow, deliberate strokes, the water whispering around him. I followed without meaning to, not wanting the space between us to stretch too far. By the time we reached the shallow end, the deck light caught the edge of movement, a figure slipping past the fence line toward the side gate. Ray called out, "Who's there?" in a tone that was more steady than I felt. The figure froze, then half turned. It was our neighbor from 2 houses down, the one who always had a reason to borrow something. "Didn't mean to bother you," he said quickly, raising his hands like he'd been caught stealing cookies. "Just heard the music. Thought you had people over." Ray's posture didn't relax until the man was gone and the gate latch clicked shut. When he turned back to me, his eyes had softened again, but the air between us felt charged in a different way now, like we'd been reminded how quickly the outside world could step in. "Sorry about that," he said, moving back toward the middle of the pool. "I like it better when it's just us." I followed him in without hesitation, the water closing around us again like a curtain being pulled. And when he reached for my hand under the surface, this time he didn't let go right away. We swam a slow lap side by side, our fingers brushing every few strokes until, at the far wall, he stopped and leaned in close enough for the water between us to still. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "maybe we don't have to wait for another invite to do this again." Before I could answer, he added almost like a dare, "But maybe tonight shouldn't end here." I didn't answer him right away, mostly because my chest felt tight with the kind of anticipation that makes words sound smaller than the moment deserves. Ray stayed close, watching me with that steady patience I'd noticed before, his hand still just under the surface, fingers brushing mine like he was testing how much space I would let exist between us. Finally, I nodded, and the small smile that tugged at his mouth told me he'd been hoping for that. "Good," he said, low and certain. Come on. We climbed out of the pool, water running down our arms and legs, the night air wrapping cool around the heat we'd carried from the water. Ray tossed me a towel and took one for himself, rubbing it across his hair before draping it loosely around his shoulders. The smell of chlorine and cedar deck boards hung in the air, mingling with the faint spice of his aftershave. And I realized I'd noticed that scent before passing in the driveway, standing too close at the fence, but never like this. He led the way toward the far end of the yard, where the fire pit flickered low. The glow hit the lines of his face in a way that made him look both older and younger at the same time. Older in the depth of his expression, younger in the way his eyes caught the light when he looked at me. We sat on the edge of the lounge chairs, the heat from the flames warming our legs while the night pressed in around us. "So," he said, breaking the quiet, "you ever think about why we never?" He let the sentence trail off, not because he didn't know how to finish it, but because maybe the ending didn't need to be said. I took a slow breath, my fingers tightening around the edge of the towel. "Maybe I didn't want to mess up what we already had," I said, and the way he nodded told me he'd thought the same. The silence after that wasn't awkward, it was heavy, charged, like both of us were waiting for the other to make the next move. When he finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, I thought he was about to say something else, but instead, his hand found mine again. This time, there was no tentative brush, no testing. His fingers closed around mine fully, the kind of hold you don't mistake for anything casual. "Ben," he said, my name quiet but deliberate. "If we don't do something about this, we're going to keep circling it forever." The fire popped softly, sending a small trail of sparks upward, and in that glow, I could see the truth in what he'd said. I squeezed his hand back, and his shoulders eased just enough to tell me he'd taken that as an answer. Then he stood, still holding my hand, and pulled me gently toward the sliding glass door that led into his house. I followed, not looking back at the pool, the fire, or the yard, because whatever was going to happen next was waiting inside. And when the door clicked shut behind us, it felt like the night had just shifted into something we'd both been quietly building toward for years. The moment we stepped inside, the air shifted cooler than outside, carrying the faint scent of his laundry detergent mixed with something warm from the kitchen, like cinnamon that hadn't been cleaned up yet. Ray closed the sliding door behind us with a quiet click, and the muffled sound of the pool filter faded, replaced by the low hum of his refrigerator. We stood in the soft light spilling from the under-cabinet strip along the counter, droplets still rolling down our arms and legs, our towels clinging in damp folds. He ran a hand through his hair, pushing it back, and my eyes caught on the way a bead of water slid from his temple down the line of his jaw. "Fire's good," he said, nodding toward the living room, "but I think I'd rather just stay here." His voice had dropped half an octave, not quite a whisper, but softer than it had been outside. I followed him as he crossed to the center of the room, his bare feet silent on the hardwood. He stopped halfway, turning back toward me like he'd just remembered he was supposed to ask permission before stepping closer. I didn't say anything, but I think my stillness was answer enough, because the next second he was standing right in front of me, close enough that the damp heat from his skin cut through the cool air. "You've been on my porch 100 times, he said, his eyes searching mine. "But this is different." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask because it was different. His hand lifted slowly, fingers brushing the edge of my towel where it hung against my shoulder. The touch was light, careful, like he was testing how much I'd let him take this moment apart before putting it back together again. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboard under his weight as he shifted, closing the last inches between us. For a beat, neither of us moved. Then, without breaking eye contact, he rested his palm against my chest, flat, warm, steady as if to feel my heartbeat and confirm it was matching his. I've been thinking about this for longer than I should admit, he murmured. The words landed heavy, not because they were a confession, but because they sounded like the truth. I swallowed, my hand coming up to cover his, not pushing it away, not pulling it closer, just letting him know I'd heard him. The air between us thickened, like the walls had closed in, and I felt my own breath fall into rhythm with his. Ray leaned in, not fast, not hesitant, but with the surety of someone who had already decided where this night was going. But just as the space between our mouths narrowed to nothing, he stopped, eyes flicking briefly toward the hallway, as if he'd heard something. The silence stretched. Then he looked back at me, a small, knowing smile touching the corner of his lips. "No one's here but us," he said softly. "So why are we still standing?" We were still standing in the middle of his living room, the low under-cabinet light spilling just far enough to catch the damp edges of our towels, when Ray stepped closer. Not fast, not like someone lunging toward a decision, but slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that gave me time to feel every second of the distance closing between us. His hand slid from my shoulder to my collarbone, the warmth of his palm sinking through the thin cotton, and my breath caught before I could steady it. "I keep thinking," he said, his voice quieter now, "how strange it is that we've been this close to something for years and never." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The rest hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. My own hand found his forearm, the skin still slightly damp from the pool, the fine hair catching the light when I moved. He smiled faintly at the touch, then leaned in, not to kiss me yet, but to rest his forehead against mine. It was almost worse than a kiss, in the best way, because it made the air between us ache with the promise of what was coming, like the moment right before a storm breaks. Then came the sound, faint, from outside, the dull thump of something on his deck. We both froze, his hand still pressed to my chest, Ray's head tilted toward the sliding door, listening, his brow furrowing for half a second before he dismissed it with a slow shake. "Probably the wind," he murmured, but his eyes lingered on the door a beat longer than his voice would admit. The pause seemed to settle something in him, because when his gaze returned to mine, it was sharper, more certain, like he'd just decided the outside world could wait. "You're not leaving yet," he said, not as a question, but as a fact. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a cautious brush or the kind of polite test that could be explained away later. It was firm, deliberate, the kind of kiss that holds years of unspoken things in the space of a few heartbeats. I felt his other hand slide to the small of my back, guiding me closer until the towels between us were just another layer we both ignored. The heat of him contrasted with the faint chill of the air, and I realized I'd stopped feeling the damp from the pool entirely. When he broke away, it was only enough to look at me, eyes searching, breathing slightly heavier, and I knew without a word that we weren't going back to neighborly distance after this. "I've wanted to do that since the first time you waved from across the driveway," he admitted, his thumb brushing just under my jaw. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly what I'd been thinking, that every casual hello, every borrowed tool, had been building to this. Instead of answering, I pulled him back in, and the second kiss was slower, deeper, lingering, in a way that made it feel like time was bending around us. We stayed like that until the need for air finally broke us apart, both of us smiling in that quiet, breathless way you do when you've just crossed a line you know you won't uncross. Ray glanced toward the hallway, then back at me with a grin that was equal parts invitation and challenge. "Come on," he said softly. "I'll get you something dry." But the way his hand stayed on me as we started down the hall told me we were both thinking the same thing. Getting dry wasn't really the point. We walked slowly down the hallway, the dim light from the kitchen trailing behind us, our shadows stretching along the wall like they'd been walking this path together for years. Ray's hand stayed at the small of my back, fingers spread in a way that wasn't just guiding me forward, it was anchoring me there. A gentle but deliberate claim that said I'm still here without needing words. The air in the house felt warmer now, maybe from the closed door, maybe from the heat between us, and each step seemed to narrow the space around us. His bare feet were silent on the floor, mine not much louder, but each soft step echoed in the stillness like a slow, steady drumbeat marking the distance left before something important. We passed an open doorway, and I caught a glimpse of a framed photo on the wall, the two of us at a neighborhood barbecue years ago, standing side by side with casual smiles and arms folded. I realized then how different we looked now. The easy politeness of that picture replaced by the unspoken weight in our eyes. The kind that comes when you finally stop pretending you don't notice someone. Ray slowed near the end of the hallway, his head turning slightly toward me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice so low it felt like he'd only meant for me to hear it, not the walls around us. I nodded, maybe a little too quickly, and he smiled like he'd caught it not in a teasing way, but as if it confirmed something he'd been hoping to see. "Good," he said simply, before opening a door on the left and stepping aside so I could pass. It was his bedroom, not the guest room I'd expected, and the sight of it caught me off guard. It wasn't staged for company. There were books stacked on the nightstand, a sweatshirt draped over the back of a chair, and the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something warm, like fresh laundry. He didn't rush to close the door, but when he did, the click was soft, almost careful. "I told you I'd get you something dry," he said, crossing to the dresser and pulling out a folded t-shirt. The fabric was warm from being stored, and when he handed it to me, I noticed his fingers didn't let go right away. "Thanks," I murmured, though the word felt small compared to the way the room suddenly seemed to hum with possibility. Ray stepped closer again, close enough that the t-shirt was pressed lightly between us. His eyes searched mine for a beat, then drifted down briefly before coming back up, and I could feel my pulse matching his. The towel around my shoulders felt heavier now, the damp edges cooling against my skin, and I realized that getting dry wasn't what either of us was really thinking about. He reached out, his knuckles brushing my arm, such a small touch, but one that carried more weight than the word "stay" he followed it with. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a request. It was something that felt older than both of us, like it had been waiting in the space between our houses for years. I didn't answer right away, but I didn't have to. The way I stayed exactly where I was told him enough, and before I could decide if this moment was about to slow down or speed up, he was already leaning in again. The moment his lips touched mine again, the world outside his bedroom ceased to matter. It was slower this time, but deeper, like he was trying to pour every year of almosts and maybes into a single kiss that neither of us would forget. The towel slid from my shoulders and landed soundlessly at my feet. The faint dampness of it nothing compared to the heat of his hands, settling firmly at my sides. I could still feel the trace of chlorine on his skin, warmed now by the closeness between us, and it made the careful distance we'd kept for years feel almost laughable. All those afternoons of waving from driveways, the neighborly "how's your day," small talk over hedges, the way we'd both hesitated too long at front doors, it had all been leading here, to this charged stillness where nothing about us felt casual anymore. When he pulled back, it wasn't to create space, it was just far enough to look at me, his breath mingling with mine. "I'm not sure what this means yet," Ray admitted, his voice low but steadier than I expected. "But I know I don't want it to end tonight." I told him I didn't either, and the flicker of relief in his eyes was as real as the warmth of his fingers still pressing lightly into my hip. He reached for the t-shirt again, handing it over like it was a peace offering and a promise at the same time. "Get changed," he said gently. I'll grab us something to drink." The words could have been nothing, a simple neighborly gesture after a swim, but the way his hand lingered on my arm before he turned told me it was more. It told me stay here. It told me I'm coming back. It told me this isn't over. I stood there for a moment after he left, the soft click of the door marking a shift I could feel in my chest. The bedroom was still warm with his presence, the scent of him caught in the air. And when I finally sat on the edge of the bed to pull on the shirt, it felt like slipping into something that wasn't just his clothing, it was his space, his trust, his choice to let me in like this. From down the hall, I could hear the quiet sounds of him moving in the kitchen, the clink of glass, the steady run of the tap, and each sound was a reminder that in a few moments he would be standing here again. And when he did, I knew there'd be no going back to the way things were before tonight. If you stayed with this story until the end, drop a comment saying, "That pool was just the start," so we know exactly who felt the heat, the shift, and the change all the way through.